Hi, I'm Peter Charles from Hooked for Life Fly Fishing, and my video today is going to cover the differences between polyleaders and Sinktips. Now, I find that when I teach spey casting courses, a lot of people don't really understand the difference between the two and they get them confused. And this can lead to a lot of fishing problems and a lot of casting problems. So I'm going to discuss the differences between the two, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a clear idea of not only the differences but how they're used. Okay, let's look at the differences between a Sinktip and a PolyLeader. I have a PolyLeader in my left hand, a Sinktip in my right. Now the biggest difference between the two is weight. Both of them are 10 foot long, though longer and shorter are available, but the Sinktip here is much heavier and it's thicker, and it requires a lot more turnover effort to get it moving and get it to turn over. This, on the other hand, is a lot lighter, a lot thinner, and it requires a lot less force to turn it over. Now, the primary difference between the two can be found in the name. This is called a PolyLeader, and this is called a Sinktip. And what that suggests is very simple. The PolyLeader is part of your leader system. It goes on the front of your fly line. Whereas the Sinktip is the tip of your fly line. It is part of your fly line. And the reason for the difference is that issue about turnover force. This requires a lot thicker fly line to turn it over than this skinny PolyLeader. One of the other key differences involves how they're tapered. The PolyLeader is part of your leader system, so it's tapered just like a regular monoleader. It is thick at the back and thin at the front, and it has a little bit of mono at the front in which to attach your tippet. Now, the PolyLeader having that kind of taper results in the back end being heavier than the front. In other words, it's not density compensated. If you were to throw one in a swimming pool, straighten it out, throw it in a swimming pool, the back end would sink faster than the front end. Now, this is not a problem when we hook them on the front of a floating fly line. That actual type of sinking profile works out quite well, and it actually produces a nice smooth droop off the end of our floating fly line. Now, our Sinktip is done a little differently. In this case, it's density compensated, which means the front end is designed to sink faster than the back end. So we get a nice smooth droop coming off of the fly line. Okay, let's look at some of the tips and leaders that I have here. I have an airflow flow tip, which is designed to work off of a Skagit head. I have a 15-foot factory Sinktip, which is designed to work off of a multi-tip weight forward Spey line. And then I have two PolyLeaders that are designed for salmon and steelhead, and I have a lighter, thinner PolyLeader designed for trout lines. Okay, let's start with the Skagit line. With that, I'm going to be using this Skagit tip called an airflow flow tip. It's quite heavy, it's quite dense, and so it requires a lot of turnover force. My next line is an older model airflow Delta Spey multi-tip line, and it has a 15-foot front end on it, and that can be exchanged with this 15-foot Sinktip. So in other words, I take the 15-foot floater tip off of it and I hook on this 15-foot Sinktip. Now, when we get down to Scandinavian shooting heads like this one, they don't have the turnover force to handle either one of these two tips. The front end of these is a lot thinner and a lot skinnier. It simply doesn't generate the force required. However, it will handle a PolyLeader very nicely. It has more than enough power to turn over one of these PolyLeaders. Now, if I get onto longer lines like this Airflow Delta 2, which is a 56-foot head in this case, I can put a PolyLeader on it as well. Though it has a little less turnover force than this Scandinavian shooting head, it still has more than enough power to turn over this PolyLeader. But you cannot put this 15-foot tip or this 10-foot Skagit tip on the end of it and expect it to turn it over, because it won't. It'll just collapse. It's not designed for that. It's designed for long distance, smooth casting, longer line, and when you build a line with that sort of construction, it doesn't have the turnover force required to handle either one of these two. So don't try and put that on the end of it. And the last thing I have here is a trout line, and I have a trout PolyLeader to go with it. Again, there's no way the trout line will turn over one of these two. When we get into the Scandinavian shooting head, I see some people try to make these work, and they won't. Even though this has a fair bit of turnover power, it's not going to be able to handle these steps. There are some multi-tip versions of Scandinavian shooting heads on the market. I'll let you know about that. And they can handle the tips designed for those systems, but they're built like this multi-tip system. Now, when it comes to fishing, PolyLeaders are available from floater all the way down to about a Type 6 extra super fast sinker. When we get to Sinktips, they're in a broad range as well. You have the floater tip, of course, plus anywhere from intermediate down to Type 8s. And when you get into Skagit heads, we can have Sinktips for them, which get into T17, T18 territory, which are around 8 to 10 inches per second for a sink rate. Now, when we're using these sinks in moving water, sink rate is only a partial guide. So if we are putting the same fly on all of these Sinktips and PolyLeaders, the depth it'll sink to will be considerably different depending on what we're using. Even a fast sink, which is roughly equivalent to a Type 3, and if I had a Type 3 here, for example, this 15-foot Type 3 sink tip will get down deeper than a Type 3 PolyLeader. These can get down fairly well, but they are limited, especially in heavier currents, and they can also be limited with high drag flies as well. So keep that in mind, that when you're using a PolyLeader, you're generally getting less depth than you would if you were using a full sink tip. And that's basically the reason why you would use one over the other. My local river is not very deep and it doesn't flow very fast, so I can do a lot of my fishing just with PolyLeaders, and I'm fine. I've caught most of my steelhead on my local river using nothing but PolyLeaders. Some of the other rivers in our area, I have to get down deeper, or I might be throwing a higher drag fly. In those cases, I'm going to be looking at Sinktips instead. So keep that in mind. These will handle the higher drag flies, they'll handle current better, it'll get down deeper, but these are great when the current's not fast and you're not going too deep. So there's the basic differences. The PolyLeader, as suggested by the name, is part of your leader system. It goes on the front end of your floating fly line. It is light, it is not density compensated, and requires some mono at the end for your tippet. The Sinktips, on the other hand, are much heavier, they're often longer, and they require far more turnover force, so they require a line designed to handle them. They are part of the fly line, that's why they have the name tip. They are the front end or the tip of your fly line, so you have to treat them as such. So if you keep those things in mind, you should have no problem matching up your PolyLeaders and your Sinktips to the correct line and having them work properly.